It is a fact of life that organisms come into the world, exist for a while, and then die. While an organism is alive, it must be continually active in order to stay alive. It takes in resources from the environment, as when you breathe, you take in oxygen, and it puts out waste into the environment, as when you expel carbon dioxide. Now, if the organism is constantly active, then that means its activities take up all of the time. If they take up all of the time available, then they must compete with one another for time. Now, this simple idea is expressed in a law, which I call the law of allocation. And it says that the proportion of time that an activity takes up is equal to its competitive weight relative to all the competitive weights of all the activities with which it competes. So the question that the law raises is, what determines competitive weight? Well, competitive weight depends on at least two things: the rate and the amount of inducing consequences. Now, inducing consequences, that means that the consequences of the action tend to keep it going. If they increase, then the activity will expand, and if they decrease, the activity will contract. And the question for research is, are the effects of rate independent of the effects of amount? That is to say, if you look at the relative time spent between two activities, the preference for one activity over the other, do rate and amount affect that preference independently? So I did an experiment with pigeons pecking at two different response keys, think of them as buttons, earning food at different rates on the two keys. And the program varied amount on the deliveries at the two keys in a way that would keep preference at a certain level. If preference moved away from the level that was to be maintained, then the amount would be adjusted so that if preference increased too far, then the amount of food delivered for that alternative would decrease, and the amount of food delivered for the other alternative would increase. And if preference dropped too low, then the opposite would happen. The alternative would have a greater amount of food delivered and the other a lesser amount of food. So that way the program maintained a level of preference pretty constant. And I did this for many different levels of preference. And then analyzed the data, found that, in fact, the effect of rate was independent of the effect of varying food. The reason that I would say this is that the effect of rate, that you remember the two keys produce food at two different rates, the effect of rate remained unchanged as the amount of food varied from one level of preference to another. So from this experiment, it seemed clear that the two factors, rate and amount, have independent effects on preference, on the allocation of time, and that makes the calculation of competitive weight relatively simple because one can simply combine the effects of rate with the effects of amount, and you don't have to take into account any kind of interaction between them.